Ever since the Vietnam War, countless films, books, and documentaries have depicted the harrowing experiences of U.S. soldiers. Still, many have focused on the broader conflict rather than the individual soldier's life. Recent personal accounts and declassified documents have shed new light on their daily struggles, from the oppressive jungle environment and the constant threat of ambush to the emotional toll of a controversial war. Join us as we delve into what life was like for a U.S. soldier in Vietnam. The class divide in Vietnam War service. Did you know that since 1973, all U.S. military service has been voluntary? But during the Vietnam War, it was a different story. 1/3 of the American troops were drafted. The Selective Service collected names of men aged 18 to 26, and when a name was drawn, that man had to report for evaluation. If he didn't qualify for a deferment, he was inducted into the armed forces and often sent to Vietnam regardless of his wishes. Many young men found legal ways to avoid or delay service. Physical issues, college enrollment, critical industry jobs, family support, or joining the National Guard could grant deferments. Out of 27 million men of draft age during the war, 60% avoided service legally. Of those who did serve, only 2.5 million went to Vietnam. The rest stayed in the U.S. or Europe. The men who served in Vietnam fell into three groups: volunteers, draftees, and those who enlisted to avoid being drafted. Volunteers often included career soldiers or recent military academy graduates. Enlistees sometimes received better assignments than draftees, choosing service on their own terms rather than by force. Since the draft ended in 1973, numerous studies have scrutinized its impact on the racial, ethnic, and social composition of American troops in Vietnam. Researchers found that the typical U.S. soldier was a 19-year-old from a poor or working-class family with no college education. This reinforced the belief that draft policies unfairly targeted society's least powerful segments. Deferments often favored the wealthy and educated. Wealthy young men could stay in college full-time to avoid the draft, unlike their less affluent counterparts who worked part-time. They also had easier access to medical deferments through family doctors. Moreover, affluent men were more aware of draft evasion strategies, often learned through anti-war meetings on college campuses. It was estimated that the American forces in Vietnam were 25% poor, 55% working class, and 20% middle class, with very few from upper-class families. Many soldiers were minorities or came from small towns. Despite being from working-class homes, strong family military traditions and limited job options drove many to enlist, seeking training and self-respect. The average age of soldiers was 19, younger than in previous wars. Many were criticized for their lack of education, with only 6% having completed college. Trekking through terror. When American soldiers set foot in Vietnam, they were thrust into a world starkly different from their homeland. The heat and humidity were relentless, and the monsoon season brought unending rain that transformed the landscape into a soggy, treacherous mire. The flat, wet river valleys, where rice paddies sprawled, were hemmed in by steep hills and dense, impenetrable jungle. This was not a land of open fields, but a labyrinth of nature's raw power. Combat troops, often on foot or dropped by helicopter into hostile terrain, embarked on grueling patrols. They carried heavy packs filled with essentials, trudging through waterlogged paddies and thick jungles. The dense foliage, alive with razor-sharp plants and swarming insects, turned every step into a painful ordeal. In the mountains, the steep inclines were both physically and mentally draining. Soldiers faced the constant threat of leeches and filthy water, leading to diseases and painful sores. These patrols, described by historian Appy as humping the boonies, were a relentless cycle of exhaustion and tension. Soldiers were burdened with 80-pound packs, rifles, and ammunition, navigating through the jungles, mountains, and paddies. The unpredictability of enemy encounters only heightened their anxiety. For every 100 patrols, only one might meet the enemy, usually in small, harrowing skirmishes rather than large-scale battles. Viet Cong guerrillas exploited this uncertainty, launching surprise attacks under the cover of darkness or stormy weather and hiding in villages or jungle depths. The Americans, constantly on edge, often felt like mere bait for enemy ambushes. The hidden dangers of landmines and booby traps exacerbated their peril, contributing significantly to casualties. Despite the rare direct confrontations, the constant threat of hidden explosives and the harsh environment made every patrol a test of endurance and nerve. Veterans recall their time in Vietnam as an endless stretch of monotony, shattered by moments of sheer terror where the weight of fear and exhaustion overshadowed the brief fleeting moments of action. The frustrations of American patrols. As American combat patrols roamed the South Vietnamese countryside, they routinely entered villages, searching for hidden weapons, extra supplies of food, young men of military age, and other signs of Viet Cong activity. Despite rarely finding strong evidence, they were convinced the enemy had been there. Suspicion grew among U.S. soldiers as villagers never seemed to trigger landmines. The Viet Cong, needing local support, trained villagers to recognize subtle signs of mines. Here's a pregnant woman who claims her husband works in Da Nang and isn't a Viet Cong, recalled former Marine E.J. Banks. But she watches your men walk down a trail and get killed by a booby trap. She knows it's there, but doesn't warn them. Maybe she planted it herself. As mines and booby traps took their toll, U.S. soldiers' anger and frustration grew. They began treating villagers harshly, sometimes beating women, children, or the elderly who refused to give information, and burning down huts and destroying food supplies. The South Vietnamese, already impoverished, suffered greatly, with many becoming refugees. They survived by scavenging from American dumps or begging soldiers for handouts. Initially, many U.S. soldiers felt sympathy for these South Vietnamese, giving candy to children and trying to help. Over time, however, they grew resentful and frustrated with the constant demands and the perceived lack of appreciation. Exhaustion-fueled atrocities. In the early 1970s, the American public was jolted by harrowing news reports detailing unspeakable acts committed by U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. The brutal scenes that unfolded were not the result of a single cause, but rather a confluence of dire circumstances that pushed American troops to the brink. Picture soldiers grappling with relentless exhaustion from grueling marches, navigating through treacherous traps, and facing ambushes that kept them on edge. These nightmarish conditions bred a profound sense of frustration and desperation. But the story doesn't end there. Imagine the unease of soldiers who, amid the chaos, began to view every Vietnamese civilian with suspicion. Whether it was a farmer, a bar girl, an elderly woman, or a child, the pervasive fear was that anyone could be an agent of the Viet Cong. This atmosphere of paranoia led some men to act in ways they would never have contemplated under normal circumstances. The U.S. military strategy played a significant role in fueling these atrocities. Instead of focusing on capturing and holding territory, American leaders pursued a strategy of relentless attrition, aiming to eliminate as many Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers as possible. The body count became the metric of success, overshadowing the complexities of distinguishing friend from foe. This relentless pursuit of numbers led to tragic civilian casualties. One soldier reflected on the grim reality. The military mission became to inflict casualties, and the primary reason for existence became to minimize your casualties. And you were sort of walking that tightrope the whole time. The My Lai massacre of 1968 stands as a chilling example of the horrors inflicted. U.S. troops stormed a South Vietnamese village, resulting in the deaths of between 300 and 400 innocent civilians. This massacre, among others, highlighted the tragic consequences of the war's dehumanizing effects. Yet it's crucial to acknowledge that many American soldiers behaved honorably amidst the chaos. Still, the poor treatment of the South Vietnamese civilians by some troops only fueled greater support for the Viet Cong and NVA. the rotting core of morale. In the early days of the Vietnam War, American servicemen rallied behind the U.S. government's decision, driven by a belief in halting the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The enthusiasm was palpable and morale was high. Yet as the war dragged on to the late 60s and early 70s, the initial vigor began to wane. The rising tide of casualties instilled fear and frustration among the troops. The endless patrols and seemingly futile military strategies wore down their spirits, making each day a grueling battle for survival rather than a quest for victory. Adding to the discontent was the one-year tour of duty rotation. Unlike previous conflicts where soldiers served until the end, Vietnam's rotation schedule meant soldiers were more focused on enduring their year-long stint than on achieving strategic goals. The constant turnover prevented the formation of strong bonds within units, leading to a focus on mere survival rather than camaraderie or mission success. The growing anti-war sentiment back home further eroded morale. Soldiers were acutely aware of the mounting opposition to the war, with some even having protested against it before their enlistment. This disconnect between the battlefield and the home front fueled doubt and dissent within the ranks. As morale continued to plummet, a host of severe issues emerged. Desertions surged from 15 per 1,000 soldiers in 1966 to 70 per 1,000 by 1972. This trend highlighted a broader crisis of confidence and commitment among the troops. Frustration with the command structure also became evident. Soldiers often took out their anger on officers, leading to the disturbing phenomenon of fragging, where grenades were used to target unpopular leaders. Between 1969 and 1971 alone, there were 730 reported fragging incidents, resulting in 83 officer deaths. Drug use became another crisis, as soldiers sought to escape the monotony and trauma of war. Marijuana use soared, while heroin addiction increased dramatically. By 1971, the number of soldiers addicted to drugs rivaled those hospitalized for combat wounds, marking a stark and troubling shift in the war's toll on American forces.